We will be going over kind of a couple different topics today: adaptive communication and creative procrastination. If you haven't seen it yet, Fishbowl 2 production is out. On that one, we talk about resilience thinking and complex systems and the criticality of diversity.
I love the Fishbowl. Bring it on.
Cus, do you mind if I kick off with just an introduction to what Agitare is? Because we got a couple of people in here who might not be entirely familiar with our overarching purpose. I don't want to
Totally. Yeah, let's do that. Dan, let's start with what is Agitare, what we stand for, and then we'll get into Fishbowl and why we're here.
Agitare is a community of practice for facilitators of discovery and design frameworks like design thinking, human-centered design, liberating structures, think wrong, Scrum, just retrospectives. There are a lot of frameworks. The official mission of Agitare is to promote and support the employment of facilitated discovery and design frameworks across the national security community. We're running all kinds of experiments to do that. And the Fishbowl is one of them because we're trying to make this a community-driven effort. So if you are interested in helping us to promote and support the employment of these frameworks, we ask members of the community join us, but also come up with your own ideas of what experiments might we run to achieve that purpose. So, and our values, as the foundation of this house, are to foster a growth mindset, to act with empathy, to demand inclusivity, to do the work deliberately, and to stay curious. So those are the ground rules. And beyond that, we're looking to, diversify our team and our community and kind of have more impacts in more places.
Thank you, Dan, for giving us a rundown of Agitare and where it came from. And we're definitely glad that all those things happened last year and we grew, and the team is stronger than ever and bouncing into 2021. So Fishbowl, what is it? So inner bowl, outer bowl type of construct where there is a group of people, inner bowl, having a deep dive discussion into a couple different topics. Today, those topics are adaptive communication and creative procrastination. And so basically these are topics that are circling the Agitare community that we feel are relevant to and are aligned with our mission, but also, they're attached to facilitation and just the community in general. And so they're just cool topics to get us going. So how that Fishbowl construct is going to work is everybody else is on the outside of the Fishbowl. And so we'll get the conversation started. And then Michael Harbin right there is going to be managing the room. And so Mike's going to go into kind of the etiquette of the Fishbowl and how you can jump into the conversation. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Cuss. Yeah, the only thing I really want to add is, feel free to jump in when you want. We're not restrictive of who's in the inner bowl or the outer bowl, but also feel free to stay comfortable in the outer bowl, right? If you want to participate without actively speaking or coming on video, that's totally fine. Please feel free to use the chat function in Zoom. Feel free to use the Miro board. We dropped the link in the chat a couple of times in Zoom. I'll drop it again a couple of times just to make sure everyone has it. And also, while we're doing this, as we go through, if there's like little nuggets of greatness that you pick up on, feel free to drop that as a note in the current Fishbowl section on the Miro board. And we'll kind of put together some notes and go from there.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah. So that's another big thing is as this grows, we are trying to make it better. And so if there's any retrospectives you have, there's also a retrospective area on the Miro board, or if you're not on the Miro board, please just put those in the chat or you can email them straight to us. I'm Cuss, and I am part of the Agitare leadership team now. Kind of just picked me up as I was working for the design space effort with Toga. So I am a civilian entrepreneur, senior technical advisor for Air Force Engineering and Technical Services out in Rota, Spain. And I'm here because I think the Fishbowl is going to be awesome. And the Agitare community has done some pretty cool stuff. And I'm really interested in design frameworks. And this Fishbowl event is really giving us a platform to just talk about relevant topics in the community and have an open space for us to chat. So I'm excited for all of you guys to be here. And without further ado, is Chris back on? There he is. We lost you.
Yeah, I'm Chris. I'm here with Agitare. We're doing a fishbowl. Welcome, guys. Awesome to see you. Adaptive communication is such a great topic for this one, right?
Yeah, it is. All right. Well, without further ado, adaptive communication was one of the topics that I threw on the list of topics to do, just because I thought that it was very relevant to one, facilitation and my introduction into facilitation, and two, just how we connect with people in general. And so there's going to be a few different perspectives you're going to get on this topic, and I can't wait to provide you mine, but that is after Dan and Chris provide theirs first. So, Daniel.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Cuss. And thank you everybody for putting this together. I'm like, I can't say it enough how excited I am to see just kind of experiments like this spin off into great content. And on that note, if you haven't seen the previous fish bowls, they're on the YouTube channel, and that content it's just really good. It should be, it should be PME material in my opinion. But also the opportunity to have conversations is also extremely useful. I would say the first time I really started considering adaptive communication was when I read the book Quiet by Susan Cain, which introduced me to the idea that introverts and extroverts, the model that has been portrayed to us is kind of a lie. It's this, and it portrays introversion as almost a disability. That she talks a lot about the book How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, and how that idea of management and idea of leadership really led a lot of people to believe that leadership is extroverted, it is boisterous and energetic, right? Which lends itself to a type of meeting, workplace, a type of, I would use the word social technology because that's what we're all about here, that excludes and silences certain voices, and it definitely doesn't amplify them. But you're better off as an organization if you make sure that all voices, all participants are able to align to what's going on, the current state of the system, the current state of the conversation, which means making it accessible. And to make it accessible, the most important thing is not necessarily the words that you put out, but just as important is where they are and what the state of the overall system is. So this is kind of related to Cynefin, and I talk a lot about Cynefin and operating in complexity. In Cynefin, when there's a lot of complexity, you have to operate to the current state of the system. You don't use best practices. You don't use, it's kind of like I talk about Team of Teams. He talks about the best practices that have been developed for conventional warfare didn't work in the complex environment of the early Iraq War. And that's because in complexity, best practices don't actually function well. You don't go, we're in this category, let's use this. Instead, what you have to do is you have to shorten the distance between detection and decisive action, which is all about detecting the actual current state of the system and making the decision from there. So that's kind of the framework, the framing that I look at adaptive communication through. And the best way to do that is to enter into a conversation first wanting to detect the state of the system and not wanting to categorize the person that you're talking to before you respond to them. You actually have to figure out the best approach for this individual person, where they are. I have a ton of experience with this as somebody who was fighting the EFMP system for years, right? I had a lot of really painful experiences where I was about to be separated from my family and my currently dying daughter. For 3 years, I was fighting this. This assignment kept coming up over and over, and I was angry and I was frustrated. And I had people pull me into counseling to tell me that my approach was the reason that people weren't helping me, which, it is kind of them saying I need to adapt my communication, but also looking back on it, considering the power differentials, right, and whose job it was to respond to whose needs in that circumstance. What was very wrong with that was I was not in a place to receive the counseling that they were giving me. I did not. I still harbor deep resentment for the people who chose to punish me for my approach rather than recognizing the urgency of my situation, right? Which is, I think, really relevant to how we think about leadership. it's sometimes somebody's lashing out, and instead of punishing them for lashing out, the most important thing is to put out the fire that's causing them to lash out, right? So there's a couple of things that I think about um, with adaptive communication. Another thing is an incident that really brought this to the forefront of my attention recently, which was I watched this exchange between a senior enlisted leader in the Air Force and a young black airman. A young black airman said on a Facebook group, he said, I have trouble trusting my white leadership. And I recognize that as a problem for the coherence, for cohesion of our organization, right? And the approach that was taken essentially bullied this young airman into leaving the Facebook group. So effectively, and I'm not going to try and speak to the actual intent of that senior enlisted leader. I have my own opinions about what it probably was. I think that he probably had a very fixed view of the reality of racial relations in the United States. He probably very politically informed, right? And so he had kind of an endpoint in mind, and he wanted to break apart this airman's perspective, this perception of what the reality was. But the most important thing to do there was to amplify and engage and invite in the narrative experience, right? Because that's how you make sense in complexity. It's driven by ground level narrative experiences, as opposed to looking at a narrative experience on the ground level and saying, that doesn't conform to my view of the world. Let's make sure that doesn't get too much air. The best, the ideal approach in this circumstance, the airman would have walked away feeling like he had been heard and that his experience was coherent with the way we were moving forward.
So I want to read to you Nicolene Dielson. She's a senior consultant behavior specialist. Her definition of adaptive communication, and then refer back to that specific instance between the senior enlisted. So adaptive communication means switching between, and I quote, different communication styles based on contextual demands, drawing on a broad range of approaches to broaden and deepen your influence on others. It's a multifaceted skill that can be honed through personal leadership development, but it can just as easily be honed with everyday practice. End quote. So, as we were, and we've discussed this incident, and I've heard you talk on it before, switching between different communication styles based on the contextual demands. I mean, what are the different communication styles that you want to highlight, but then also like the contextual demands and the complexity of that?
Yeah.
Can you touch on that?
Yeah, communication styles is an interesting idea because there's this thing that we're taught in design, in design and development work, all fields of design thinking, user experience, the deep research stuff that's like UI and development. But it is the ability to listen to understand. And I've actually heard, who is it, Chris Armstrong, the head of Veritas Culture, he talks a lot about this. I had a conversation with him where he talks about culture facilitation, and their culture facilitation certification, he said they have like a 20% pass rate. And he said the most difficult thing for people to do is to engage in a conversation with people they might violently disagree with, they might vehemently disagree with, but still listen to understand. Because the most important thing is to figure out what you need to respond to. But what most people end up doing is they're not able to kind of separate their own biases or their own predetermined, preconceived notions about the world from the exchange. And there's a whole conversational style that is mostly question driven. But I will say that the Socratic method, this is an example. I didn't actually think that the whole Socratic method, which is question driven, could be used to bully somebody, but that's exactly what I saw in that exchange. He used it in such an aggressive way and also with very leading questions. It is, in design work, you use open questions, which welcome the other person to bring their absolute truth to their responses, which doesn't mean you're trying to steer them in a particular direction. And that's what Chris Armstrong told me when I was talking to him about culture facilitation. He said that most people just don't get there. I also want to ping on something you said, Cuss, which is the role of deliberate practice, because I talk a lot about how navigating in complexity is not a matter of the frameworks you use. It's actually a matter of who you are. And also Karen Petty-Hold, the director of Designs Thinking DC and Summer of Design, her upcoming book is about becoming somebody who's capable of designing for others. And I think that's an important aspect to consider for leadership in this particular skill set. Deliberate practice, Brene Brown talks about it too, like being vulnerable and creating a psychologically safe conversation. She talks about how important it is to do role playing, which that's deliberate practice right there. You need to get your reps in before you're actually, like, as an identity, as a part of yourself, you're capable of responding in the way that you ought to, because things you can't anticipate will happen in those conversations, and you need to be capable of kind of pulling your ego out of it and going, what do I need? What most needs to happen in this conversation so that this person has more of a voice and we're moving in a positive direction, like have a goal. But also, I think it's important to not predetermine that goal before you've checked in with the person. Because the people who talk to me about my communication around the Exceptional Family Member Program, their goal was to get me in line. But there was something much more urgent happening there that they could have discovered if they had approached me with, let's really find out what's going on here, maximize my voice, really diverge before we start coming up with theories about the way forward, right? Which, I like to give a shout out to Chris recently, who had a difficult conversation on behalf of Agitare Our Values. And I don't want to get too much into that specifically, but what he did was he had a conversation, and that is, and I kind of wanted to get into the TIMN framework, but I've been talking for a little while here. But conversation is how you get somebody aligned at the very start to, we now have a shared goal and let's move forward with that. And you need to do that in that conversation right there, not before the conversation, but go into the conversation with kind of an open mind about what the way forward might be. And then, kind of find out based on where they are, where the system is, where they fit into the system, what their past experience is, who you are in the conversation. All of those things need to inform the way ahead.
The thing that I love about listening to you, Daniel, speak to these is the theoretical aspect of them. And I knew that you were going to touch on those. So I was going to go a different route, which was down to the basics of communication as a fundamental connection between individuals, between people, and how we have gone so far away from that because of all the different adaptive communication connections we can make now. Just in this call, we have, voice, video, we have Miro, we have chat, we have language, we have facial expression, we have body expression. All these things are ways we adapt our communication to get our point across or to become more influential to the people that we are trying to influence, which, in this communication, just in this framework, yes, there's the people in the Zoom room, but then there is the potentially thousands or millions of people that will be capable of watching this via YouTube later. And so you think about the present, and then you think about the future. So because of all these, and this is kind of where my mind went, was because of the complexity of our current status as far as like where we are at in our communication in the current day, which is we just have so many ways to communicate. I live in Spain, and so basic communication for me is limited, even though I am 85% fluent in Spanish. My wife, however, is not. And so we're reminded every single day about the communication barriers that in that language itself has, and we rely more on universal gestures and and the more basic forms of communication. And so it really made me think about a couple things. One is on the Miro board I have a video link, and it's about a Morgan Eastman she's deaf, and she talks about how adaptive communication allows people with disabilities to be more included, and that really brought it down to, from the theoretical level down to the personal level, as far as how can we be more inclusive with our forms of communication, and how that particular talk that she gave on a TEDx talk made me think about how we can become better facilitators with our communication, and how we can adapt our communication styles to be more inclusive in these realms. Because sometimes we get so, I remember when I first was introduced to the design community, was with you, Dan, and then with Toga, and there was all these words that were new to me, and Miro was new, and so it kind of was a little bit daunting at first. And so, but then once I became into that realm of design and discovery, I wanted to bring more people along with me, but I wanted to make that onboarding process a little bit easier. And so what I introduced into the designing space effort was more forms of taking those theoreticals and bringing them down, as far as like, okay, let's break this down a little bit. Let's use video, and let's allow people to, me to create these forms of content which I felt were more inclusive and easier to digest. And so that, for me, is the adaptive communication portion that I really focused on. And if you've given me a minute, I'll explain where this is rooted in my history. And it really goes to show exactly what you were saying about, I think it was Karen Betty Hold, who talks about the person, right? And so my brother, Yannick, he has sensory integration disorder. And he, as a young child, he wasn't speaking properly. He couldn't eat. And it just seemed like his senses were off. And sensory integration disorder really is, the term is perfect, because it just means that your senses are not calibrated. And so you might be having a conversation and you think he's listening to you, but really he's hearing the fan. He's also hearing the street noise, and he's hearing the traffic, and it's just very overwhelming. And so also like textures. And so he only could eat a specific amount of food because every other texture just made his senses just spike. And so I spent a year on a science project trying to understand his disability and what were the best therapies for his current condition. And so we spent a year very much just trying to understand how he communicated with the world. And what it taught me is there was things where we would put him on a horse, and he would we would tell him to go touch a color on a pole, and just the sensory interaction between the communication of us telling him what to do and then turning that into a physical really made those connections for him. And so I love that we've gone from this theoretical down to the physical. And so I would implore everybody in the room to give thought to that, as far as when you're in facilitated practice, or when you're in design, or even when you're just talking to people in general, that first start with foundational before you go heavy, and see if you might be missing some links there.
So yeah, as partially inspired by Susan Cain's book, but also because I am I tell people all the time to repeat themselves, because I am really distracted by, like, partially it's ADHD, but partially it's also, the sounds that are going on and the texture of something I'm wearing, and also the fact that my stomach hurts. But I find it difficult to actually process what people are saying to me a lot of times for that reason. And for that reason, I stopped going. I think I brought this up at the previous Fishbowl. I stopped going to going away parties in the military. I didn't go to them anymore, unless I was really intimate with somebody. Even then, I hear they're going to a bar or something, and I'm like, you all, if I go there, you're going to look at my face and it's going to bum you out, because I am going to be having a terrible time. I just hate it in bars. I hate the sounds. It's really loud. People are trying to talk to me and I'm struggling to process what they're saying. It's a really unpleasant experience for me. And something I thought about for a while was what, you know, this would might have been one of my first really deep design explorations that I, just kind of mentally was, what if we designed a unit event that actually took the needs of everybody who was participating in that event into account, and we didn't pretend that, and partially this is, I grew up in a very large church, right? And they had these massive church events that were supposed to be like parties. And I remember very specifically that I would have panic attacks every time they had these things. And I would feel terrible because everybody around me was having a good time and I was unable. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized, oh, that's just a natural thing. I don't like being around large crowds. I don't like lots of noise. And, so I think about that a lot in the military is we have this mindset of everybody's basically like this, right? We can just do it. If we provide beer, then it will probably get like 90% success rate with people having a good time. Also, I think it probably contributes to the amount of beer that people drink, because in my alcohol drinking days, I can tell you alcohol, and one of the reasons it became a problem for me is because it helped me cope with that. And so I used it to get through difficult social circumstances, which turned it into a problem. And so, when I stopped drinking, it was like, I can't go to this because it doesn't reflect me. It doesn't actually meet my needs. And I'm actually going to make everybody else unhappy, So that's kind of just to speak to what you just talked about when you were talking about sensory processing. I think that even on at that level, absolutely, talking about adaptive communications, my daughter was unable to reach anybody but my wife and I because we understood how she communicated. But even I think that extends to everybody, even people who, might not even be diagnosable. Where somebody is at and what they're feeling in a certain environment, some people need to be in a quiet room to have a deep conversation. And I think a lot of people don't think about that. They're like, oh, I just pull them aside and we're going to have a really intense conversation. If you're going to have an intense conversation, you should know the ideal environment for the person you're talking to. Because I can tell you, I've been in some conversations they thought I was engaged with because it was really intense and important. And I was like struggling to be present because I'm like, there's just so much noise here. I hate open office environments. They're hell for me. It's just the worst. So yeah, that's, to kind of build on what you just said, Cuss, this whole, all these other aspects of how we feel in our environment and the noise and the sensations, I think it affects all of us in a way that we don't really quite recognize. And if we actually designed our conversations, talking about Daniel Stillman, right? We've been sharing some of his content in the Agitare channels. Good Talk is his book about designing conversations. That's exactly what this, I can't believe I didn't bring it up in my intro, but I got too much bouncing around in my head.
Adaptive communication is really interesting to me. It's become more interesting as technology has grown and evolved. I think last year coming into this year has been extraordinary for the concept of adaptive communications because we've all at one time had to adapt together. Some of us were more prepared for that than others. And every day you were evolving the way you communicated, whether it was all those ways, Cuss listed out earlier, or a million other ways. You're having tough conversations, you're having academic setting conversations, you're having friendship and peer network conversations. You're doing your work, you're doing everything in this environment over something technologically related, right? So that goes to intercommunicating in the 21st century, which I think is just such an extraordinary thing to reflect on. And how do we reach people and design conversations, like you were saying earlier, around them? I think it's one of the truest tests of empathy too when you talk about adaptive communications, because what you're trying to get at the end of the day, or at least this is kind of Chris's outlook on it, I am doing my best to understand where I am and get to the other person's narrative. I want the sender's story to be told to me in the truest and most comfortable way that it can. And I find that as a facilitator, and especially in national security or the defense space, to be so critical to communication in general. If I can find a way using all these different, myriad technologies, all these layers of communications that we have, if I can find a way to get them at a point where they're being their truest self and telling their truest story, I feel like that's a moment that I want to remember and hold on to, because maybe that venue or that medium that we've used isn't best for me, but it's best for them. In sum, that adds the most value, I think, to the conversation. It's not about what works perfectly for me as a receiver, but it's about how I can put them in a position to feel more comfortable, and I adapt to their environment. Right at the end of the day, that's my simpler take on it, without giving too much of a narrative and hopefully not cutting out mid sentence. You guys are nodding your head, so I'm assuming something's coming through.
No, that was really good. And I actually didn't ever think about the importance. So one person in a conversation usually has power of some sort. And I think that, you talk about facilitation, the facilitator has power. Their goal is to extract the narrative and make sense of it, sense making based on the lived experience of the person they're talking to. And so in that case, the most important thing is that the person expressing the narrative feels psychologically safe, that they feel that they're equipped to kind of speak their truth, right? As opposed to, as a facilitator, where am I most comfortable? Which I think a lot of people don't consider themselves facilitators, but they also, even when they're not, I'm a facilitator, if they're a leader, um, they should be most curious about, you know, I'm the one in power in this circumstance. So actually the narrative experience of the person that I'm speaking to holds so much weight that that's the most important thing to extract here. So there's like a differential in obligation there to consider, the needs of the person you're talking to.
Yeah, I
So
actually liked Harbin. Michael, you just posted something good in there. How can I increase my detection network, or understand the situation that's taking place? We reference Kinevin a lot with Agitare. One of the things that stuck out to me, and I think I even mentioned it in the last Fishbowl, was to understand you're part of the problem. That doesn't mean that this problem is some critical issue that you're dealing with, or it's a battle you're fighting. But in this case, it's finding the right way to communicate. It's adapting your communication. As long as you understand that you and that sender are there together in that system to figure out how to communicate to one another most effectively, or even at an organizational level, how to communicate down and up your organization the most effective way, you are part of that process. You're part of that system. Embrace that, right? So get down into that system and understand it and look at it. And I would say that's where you can start to get some detection understood. I would actually love to hear if anybody else has any thoughts on that point too.
Yeah, I've had some folks come in. So I'm fortunate enough to, we have a big open area, Daniel. So I completely agree with you on just that being overwhelmingly noisy and it just destructive to getting things done. And when I worked out there, it was like having an ulcer and eating spicy food constantly, where you just could never get comfortable, always irritable, because of the constant stress from it, and trying to participate in 85 different discussions going on and feeling like you're supposed to be part of them. Now I'm fortunate that I moved up into an office with one other person in there, and we get a lot of traffic through there. But the I kind of, something else that kicked off in this, that's been a project of mine for about the last year and a half, was I noticed it was the squadron operations officer that I share the office with, and I noticed that the predecessor, whenever somebody came in and wanted to talk to something, he would physically change chairs and sit, ideally like facing that person, so he was away from his computer, away from his phones and everything. And if the phone rang, he'd look at me and be like, "Hey, do you mind grabbing that real quick?" Whatever, to kind of like commit to that conversation, to him, to allow him to kind of put all of his energy into, I think it was, he probably read all these books, reading the person and determining what the conversation was really about. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And I told him, he taught me that, and he was just like, huh? Because it's just through watching that. But it is so hard, because I'll, constantly in the middle of an email or something, and somebody will walk in and say it. And we had a guy who was going through all sorts of stuff in his life, all sorts of previous exposure, probably some psychological trauma from stuff that he'd done, 5-10 years ago, and maybe even before that in his life. but he stopped by one day and was just like, hey, I just asked, how are you doing or whatever. And he was, fine, gave the usual thing, but then he kind of just paused. And that was when I realized, okay, this is when you push away from the desk. And this is when hey, why don't you grab a seat if you got a minute? And then all this stuff came out that he was just like, my life is a shambles right now. I feel like this, I feel like that, I feel like this. And as a what I'd say is a positive story, it's just difficult because sometimes when somebody confides in you, you feel almost like I joke that that I put on the collar. I grew up Catholic, so I always say, put on the collar and tell me, tell me your sins, my son. Tell me what's going on in your life. But probably about 5 minutes after he left, I closed the door and talked to the ops officer and said, do you realize this is going on in this person's life? And I hope that I helped avoid a situation like Daniel went through, where, hey, there's people have a lot of stuff going on right now in life. Just summer design, Karen Petty Holt talked a lot about just treating people with grace, just that little bit of grace, to not just assume what's going on. And it's so difficult because your bias comes into play too, that you're like, they're just lazy, or they just don't know, they just don't want to get on the internet, or they're busy playing video games, or all these excuses that come up. Something, and I'll stop after this. We have an Offutt what is it, leadership group on Facebook, or Offutt, a kind of a little bit of crosstalk group, and somebody posted in there, they were asking what we would recommend for them to inspire empathy in their supervisors, because one of their supervisors, there's somebody who is immunocompromised, and they're terrified of getting COVID, and their supervisor said it's all made up anyways. And so they're like, how do you face that environment? And that one, I chimed in because I hit kind of close to home, where I just said, there's a conflict of values there. And I said, focusing on military necessity, what is the military need? How can we address, again, a little bit of design, what is your house statement? What is your problem statement? How can we accomplish the military need in the current environment? And part of that military need that came in as a side discussion in that post was the part of the person's anxiety was increased by not having the regular interaction in the office, which was a thing that came up during summer design, that we identified too, that people didn't have that normal office social interaction, and they were just starving from it. So that was a question I threw out there, was, given the tools that we have, are there ways that we could do that? Can we have a small scheduled office Zoom with a set agenda, to kind of provide some structure for the folks that really do need that structure, but give them a 5-minute block of time in their small group? And again, honoring what Daniel had said, of not trying to overwhelm them with a wall of pictures in Zoom, and everybody worrying about what's actually going on the camera and how it shows your background, like this mess right here. But offering them that safe environment with a small group, just to kind of, again, allow the sensor suite to see, I've seen them, and I'm seeing them now, and I'm seeing them again tomorrow, and all throughout the week. And over time, you get those observations that you're like, something's not right here, and maybe we need to intervene. So I'll pause there.
So this is Ward, and I'm going to piggyback on, because if the question is being present and finding out how people are and adapting your communication to them, I will tell you this much. If I see someone who's having a bad day, I will ask them straight out. In the past 2 years, I've asked them a lot. And the reason I wanted to unmute and tell you is, we have military come in and go out. And so they stay there for 3 years. And as they're going out, I had somebody write me a letter, and I want to read part of the letter to you, so I don't give it away who it was. But one of the things that really makes me feel visible is when someone notices that I'm frustrated or having a bad time with someone. And you're usually the first and often only person to intentionally ask me about it and help me climb back out of my own head. I think I would have had a lot more ugly days here if I didn't know you. So I wanted to thank you for always being there for me and making me feel seen. Okay. So that's one person. The other person actually told me 2 years later, you saved my life. And I was like, what are you talking about? Sure enough, that particular person had such a bad day that they were really, really having a bad day, as in they were thinking seriously about bad things. And they ended up, because they talked to people, going and seeing a therapist, which is great. That's a go and fix your things. But as far as I'm concerned, yes, you have to adapt to the people, but even just seeing and listening to them, you're reaching across the divide, and that makes, to everyone, to you don't realize how much it matters until it could be years later. It could be never. They may never say anything, and that's fine. But ask the question. It's worth it. It really is worth it. Trust me on this one. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I'm also seeing, I'm seeing a couple of things reflected here, which are the different, as far as what strategies there are out there to make sure this happens. There's a couple of different social technologies. There's, retrospectives are something that I recommend every team engage in. And retrospectives are an agile scrum practice where you basically, at the end of a sprint, you look back and you're like, what went right? What went wrong? What do we feel kind of whatever about? And then you create action items based on those things. So my experience being introduced to retrospectives was that I was on this team and we had very high psychological safety, and people would come in and they'd join us, and they were weirded out by this practice that we did, which was every single Friday we would do a retrospective that wasn't just work related. It was, hey, what's everybody positive about? Just do like a three sections and put sticky notes up, and you do it silently. You start with just, here's a thumbs up section or a smiley face section, here's a kind of whatever section, and then here's a frowny face section. Just write something this week that I feel good about, something that I feel bad about, something that I'm kind of whatever about, but I want to talk to. And you do that silently for like 10 minutes, just silence and people writing. And what that does is it creates this reflective space. You're together in silence. And that's more powerful than I think a lot of people realize. It's a weird experience. It feels weird, but good facilitation should kind of feel uncomfortable, right? And what ends up happening is that people, week after week, they get more and more to a place, and also it kind of starts. They get to a place where they're saying more kind of vulnerable stuff, and they're actually bringing. I was introduced to the concept of bringing your whole self to work from Kim Scott's book Radical Candor, which is an incredible read. If you haven't read it yet, it's a brilliant book about a lot about this topic. So that idea of rituals, like weekly, we do this on the Agitare team. Every week we get together, we have the leadership team, and we just talk to, a lot of it is we talk to our objectives, and that's where it was mostly. But a lot of weeks, it's what's on everybody's mind right now, what's most heavy. And that feels like the most important thing that we need to get to right now. And I've considered, you know, maybe even moving that to a different time, although that now you're demanding more time of people. So I'm hesitant to do that. But I can tell you that, and I've been doing Austin's coffee talks as well every week, which are now happening on Thursdays. And I drop in and we just have a conversation, not about anything in particular, but just conversation. And I think a lot of people, so retrospectives are one social technology, but another one to really deeply consider, in that kind of Ward was touching on, is just have a conversation, and not even a conversation for a purpose, right? Which is a crazy thing to think about. But the best teams make it, like, they make it happen either because we feel comfortable with each other. I think a lot about when I learned about the concept of psychological safety, I thought back to the times in my career when I felt psychologically safe, mostly were when I was hiding from the institutional levels of my job. I would form these small tribes of friends. We would get together. We'd talk a bunch of shit about, the work that we'd been given, the pointlessness of our jobs, how we felt about what was going on. But that was an important thing for me. And the thing I'm trying to promote is that you can actually do that intentionally as a leader and create that tribal kind of coherence and alignment through conversations by, through intentionality, right? Some people need it one-on-one. Some people need it in larger groups. It varies from person to person, right? This is adaptive communication, but just the idea of employing conversation without an agenda is it sounds crazy in military, in most of the organizations I've been in, the idea that we would just sit down and kind of go, what's on everybody's mind? Here, I'll start. I'm going to be vulnerable for a second, talk about something, right? And then I've seen it happen. I've seen that pay off recently because of, in the wake of the racial issues last year and the police brutality and conversations about race, I saw leaders see, and this is what my latest video was about. What kind of kicked it off is this idea that I saw these senior leaders, Chief Wright and General Goldfein, they had a conversation, a vulnerable conversation, and they modeled the behavior for us. And then I saw leaders just go, oh, that's what we're doing? All right, let's have some vulnerable conversations. And they started doing it at the group level, at the unit level. And what I saw come out of that was leaps and bounds more effective than the Master Resiliency Trainer program. And the reason for that is because the MRT program is an institutional approach to what is a tribal problem. So yeah, I'm not gonna rant more on that, but
No, hey, actually, I want to. I know we kind of talked about in the planning of this a little bit, talking about the TIM in framework, right? And you just kind of touched on it a little bit. And I don't know if everyone here has the same context. I've heard you speak about it before. I still don't have the same context. So if you could touch on this framework that you're talking about, this tribal institutional, the TIM in framework, real quick, just so I
yeah,
learn a little
absolutely.
bit.
Yeah, and I'm going to try and be real quick with it because I feel like I'm already eating up too much time here. But so the TIMN framework is this thing that I learned from this book, Design Unbound, which is a really cool book. And it basically is the theory that society is organized on multiple constructs. There's the tribal level, which is kind of the ancient form. You had tribal bands that were less than 150 people, which is Dunbar's number. And they operated primarily through the oral tradition. They would just communicate with each other orally. They'd pass stories on. Most of the information that was relevant to the society for their coherence and alignment was just conversational, right? And then you hit the agrarian age, agrarian society, you have to scale up, which requires institutional forms. We need information to be carried forward to more people and further forward in time, right? So the institutional forms look like written communication. And I would say in our Air Force construct, most of our communication is in institutional forms. It's like, oh, this information is relevant. Let's put it on the SharePoint, right? We're like, if we could just get the SharePoint right, everybody would be aligned to our strategy and our mission and vision, right? We just got to get the SharePoint right. And I see people try and solve problems using trackers and dashboards and those, but that only solves institutional level problems, right? So the rest of the TIMN, I think I'm thinking Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles when I want to add T there, but the rest of the TIMN framework is you got tribes, institutions, markets, which are, we create markets, we create competitive environments for trade, for example, and that rides on top of institutional infrastructure. We create the market so that people can buy and sell things. And then there's networks. Networks are really difficult to handle. They're, like the internet, you have these conflagrations of energy happen in this specific place, but they're very fluid. Membership is not like, people aren't aligned to these networks. They're just like, yeah, a lot's happening there, so I'm in there, but then I'll kind of duck out. Whereas tribes are a little bit more, we're moving forward and we're aligned to the context of the tribe. And I would say that Agitare is, in many ways, a tribe. It is the tribal form. Most of our alignment and coherence happens through conversation, through events. And we're like, where is everybody right now? Right? We do that thing you do in complexity where you probe the system and you're like, how do we respond to this right now? And in that way, tribal forms of communication are constantly, it's okay to constantly change context because people are complex and they're constantly changing context. So one like clear example of this for me is the way we respond to issues of resiliency or, in the Air Force. We are primarily interested in coming up with best practices that we then codify for the institution. And we're like, this is going to be implemented at scale through a program, right? Which is an institutional approach. It is, here are the rules. And if you look at it overlaid onto Cynefin, The institutional approach is also assuming the system is ordered, right? So if we could predict cause and effect in advance, then best practices would work, which means that we could carry all this information forward into the future and it would continue to work. What we put on the SharePoint last month is still relevant to the context today. But that's not the case with resiliency, because intervening when somebody is in a particular mental crisis, emotional state, whatever, is not something you respond to with best practices, right? It's something that you have to have a tribe level intervention, in this case, a conversation or a facilitated discussion where you let narratives guide what happens next. So that's kind of my view of the TIMN framework and how it applies to the, I think it's really applicable to the subject of adaptive communication, because most unit level communication is broadcast. The unit commander, most of their conversations with the ground level is just blast out this. And if I just say the right things, it's gonna engage everybody. It's gonna make them feel aligned. But I've never received an email from a unit commander that I felt emotionally aligned to, because they tried to design it for everybody in the unit, not for me. Which means that, yeah. Go ahead,
Sorry,
Jeff.
Dan. So does this framework, so as I'm understanding it, it's kind of foundational at the tribal level, correct? And then it builds from there is how it was designed, right? And so what if you have fractured tribes?
Well, I mean, the Team of Teams is a great example of that. He talks about the dysfunction of the Joint Special Operations Task Force largely came from the fact that people were so aligned to their own tribes that they didn't feel a sense of coherence to the larger organization. And they were actually working at cross purposes. They didn't understand each other, the communication happening in this other SEAL team or whatever, right? There was a disconnect there. So if you're actually going to try and work as an institution, as a large scale organization together, you need to somehow create coherence between tribes, which are okay. It's okay to have pockets of tribes that are aligned to each other, groups of friends and cliques, right? But they should also have an opportunity through tribe level alignment methods, through tribe level social technologies, to achieve coherence to the larger organizational goal. And Team of Teams does a really good job of describing how, General McChrystal and Chris Fussell went around, and their whole team went about doing that. They used things like the daily 1 hour, call, right? And they also did this thing where they had relationships became a part of their fundamental values, which I thought was really interesting. The idea that relationships are a core component of our strategy moving forward isn't something that a lot of people consider. And the way that they went about implementing that was by having LNOs embedded in the various tribes who understood each tribal context to kind of create that cross-pollination, which, if you think about it, is them kind of aligning with the tribes, but also bringing some of the previous tribes, their context, so that tribe could be aligned to it as well. Now we're speaking the same language, right? So there's not so big a gap between these two tribes.
Yeah, I would like to go on that one for just a second too. So because I do like the book, and I think there's a quote in there that really backs up what you're getting at, Daniel. What I got, and this is where I'm saying a stretch on such a interesting thought leader, trying to interpret it. They were trying to get these pockets or these tribes to tell their stories openly in an open environment with trust, where we could let that information flow, right? One of my favorite quotes there is purpose affirms trust, trust affirms purpose. That's how you forge individuals into teams, or in this case, organizational elements or small pockets of tribes into teams. So I think purpose and trust drives that. And I think that's also partly adaptive communication at the organizational level, is finding a way to put that purpose out there and build that trust across the team so that you can have a way to tell those stories and those narratives back and forth. And in this case, for an environment that was, extremely adaptive and complex and ever changing. I mean, they were in one of the most ever changing environments you could think of, early 2000s, right? I just wanted to add that a little bit.
All right, so moving forward, our second topic, with just about 20 minutes left, we are going to get into the creative procrastination, which sparked from Adam Grant, who had a TED Talk, The Surprising Habits of Original Thinkers. And so I really am interested to see what Chris and Dan have to say about this topic. So why don't you guys start off, guys?
Creative procrastination. I mean, geez, this is like the balance I think I try to find in my life all the time. Because I oftentimes feel like I am so much more somebody who wants to just execute and do everything in this planned and regimented way. You guys have heard me talk about this before, where, you know, I have the MBA and the project management side of my brain and the design side of my brain, and I just run them into one another. Adam Grant does a way better job talking about this than I could. I would just say, and then see what inspires conversationally. For me, trying to procrastinate is tough, but it's been so worthwhile the times that I've done it. And I look at it from a perspective which is a little easier for me. I need to give the idea or the concept or the complex thing I'm working on, I need time for that stuff to bounce around my brain. And I don't realize that at the time sometimes. I just need the idea to mature, the concept to mature. Otherwise, I immediately do that one thing that I can't stand doing and I know I do it a lot of times. I jump to the solution. I want to skip everything in between. I want to skip all the thought and research, and I just want to solve the problem. I am a solver quite often. So being able to try, I am not a creative procrastinator, absolutely not. But when I aspire to be and just give things a break and take a breath and step away, I notice that it helps. But I will gladly admit that I am on the spectrum. I do not fall in creative procrastinator range.
I'm really reminded. I don't remember the chapter specifically from Adam Grant's book on creative procrastination, but I love the book originals. And but I was reminded of this thing from this book, Orbiting the Giant Hairball, which is a wonderful book where he talks about a farmer walking up to cows and shaking a stern finger and shouting, "You slackers, get to work or I'll have you butchered." And he says, what this man does not understand is that even as he threatens them, the cows are performing the miracle of turning grass into milk. Nor does he understand that his shouting will not cause the cows to produce more milk. If we drew a line to represent a creative occurrence, the only portion that would reflect measurable productivity would be a short segment at the end of the line. So it's this idea of cows are producing milk the whole time they're standing there, right? They're eating grass, but you only actually see the output. So I think about this a lot with writing, right? Because I do a lot of writing, and I also do a lot of writing where I have a sudden burst of energy. And I'm like, I have to get this thought out there, and I create this blob of text, and it's full of my current context, right? My current emotional state, kind of what makes sense to me. And the most effective things that I've ever written tend to be where I then wait and I'm like, I gotta give this thing room to breathe. And I walk away and I do some other things. Usually I try to sleep between the first draft and actually releasing something. And then I go and I read it with new eyes, because the difference in logic between me being in that state of initial, burst of creativity and me being in that reflective state of the editing mode, and now I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody who's consuming this. This is adaptive communication as well, right? It's um I understand my thoughts really well. They make perfect sense to me, once I put them down on paper. But it doesn't necessarily reach people unless I've really thoroughly considered, multiple angles of attack. So for me, creative procrastination is something um, that I do intentionally. Another practice I started taking up was actually listening to books that are not analytical on the subject I'm writing about. So I started listening to books on theoretical physics, and that was inspired by listening to Carlo Rovelli's The Order of Time, I think it was. And it's way over my head. Like, I don't understand 1/10 of what he says in there. He's talking about quantum gravity. But there's this weird thing that happens by being, and I think that it's related to meditation, honestly, and mindfulness and putting yourself in a different emotional and mental state. But there's this really interesting thing that happens. And I think that's why everybody should read fiction and read more than just books about leadership, right? Is because when all you're consuming are other people's regurgitated theories that they read from other people regurgitating theories, most of them writing books in order to further their careers as consultants, you don't end up actually internalizing and being able to reflect on that material in context very well. It's too detached from the narrative level, like what this looks like in practice, and also the complexity of it. You read a book by, like Adam Grant makes wonderful books. I am a huge fan of his books, but I don't think that it's complete to just understand the underlying theories of a thing. You actually need to bounce that theory off of a whole bunch of other interrelated information before you can truly internalize what it means in practice. So that's kind of, yeah, creative confidence for me includes consuming a broad range of things and also making sure I pepper it in there between content creation and, conversations with others. It's really just a matter of filling my cup with good, rich, diversified material before I go just kind of spitting stuff onto the page.
So one of the things I found that was interesting was one of Anna Grant's students, Jian Shin, who is professor of University of Wisconsin now, did this study with two groups of people. And what they did was they gave the group of people the same task. But what they did was they allowed one group to just get the task and do the task. And then the other was to have them give the task, which is to submit some ideas, some creative ideas for a project. But before they were working on their task and submitting them, they would have them play Minesweeper and Solitaire. So they were given the task, then they played, then they submitted their ideas. So the group that did not play was 20% less creative, and this was, their ideas were given to a separate entity. Now, the same thing was done, but then just they had people play before the task was given to them, and there was no difference. And so there's a straight correlation to having a task, inserting a playful activity, and then the divergence that has occurred after that.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that has extreme value when you're talking about facilitation, or if you're talking about these practices where we're taking, we're giving space for divergence to come along, but also for me, particularly, like, my creative contributions to the design community have been in the form of, video content creation, and really that procrastination is like, I rely on it because it really, I have the task at first, which is how am I going to, take this, all these design language and efforts and compile it into something that reaches the broadest crowd, but also sends that message, right? And so what I'll do is I'll take the content that I have and put it into a timeline, and then I'll just let it sit. And then typically I'll let it sit until, somebody pings me, like Dan or Chris, like, hey, when's that Fishbowl content going to be created? And then it becomes more applicable up into the last moment. And I have a lot more data points and a different perspective to put the final touches on it. So that for me was a lot of what Adam Grant's originals also touched on, and their original ideas, the ability for people to wait or to let things marinate or to play with ideas before they put the finishing touches on them, and allow convergence and intersections to happen first before finalizing.
So, cause I have to add, so either Agitare or the Deaf Channel or the Meadow, one of them deserves credit for what I started to do. And the reason is there was a video, I think, that was pegged to the Agitare channel, and it was a gentleman who was presenting, look, just write. Okay, just for 2 minutes, write something. And so what I started doing is writing stream of consciousness. And I didn't realize, but this is exactly, it's both meditative, and you don't realize how much stuff is in your head. Once you put it on paper and you start looking at it, you're like, oh yeah, that's an idea. I have ideas. You have thoughts about your past. So all this stuff all of a sudden and it says just write 2 pages, stream of consciousness. Don't worry about how it writes, reads, anything like that. But that is hugely effective because it allows as far as for me, it's allowed me to process all the stuff. So I have like 30 pages worth of stuff for the last 15 days of trying to synthesize all the pieces to it, because there's tons in there, but you don't realize it's all floating around in your head all the time. And until you put it on a piece of paper, which is both relaxing and challenging, that it just comes out. And once you have it out on a piece of paper, then you can start looking at it and dissecting it. And it's whether I realized it or not, I didn't realize we were going to talk about this. That is, as far as I'm concerned, creative procrastination. It sort of forces you to do it, whether you love it or not. So yeah, just wanted to throw that out there. So thank you and damn you both at the same time.
For sure. Chris, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to chime in with, so I was thinking in terms of all this, in terms of context shifting too, because at least in my work environment, it is, I mean, when I flew, it was always crisis needs to be solved, solve it and make it go away. And I think that the government and the military model is always, it's that ready, fire, aim. There's a problem, I have a solution, implement solution, the problem goes away. Unfortunately, I think that is probably one of the least effective ways and efficient ways to solve complex problems. John Hawley was our facilitator and our mentor for summer design, and John would have us do what he calls, and this is his term, mental sherbet, where we do these little kind of these fun little creative something to kind of get you going. I borrowed it for facilitating a session at our last offsite that we had for work, where we just, like, I think what I did, and please feel free to steal or borrow and use, but I had them close their eyes for one thing, because I had to use voting, and I didn't want anybody to feel like they were winning and somebody to feel like they were losing. And an interesting thing was the trust piece afterwards. They were like, did our votes actually matter, or did you already have this planned? And their votes actually did matter, but I had them pick like Netflix, Hulu, or Disney Plus, and then Marvel, DC, or Star Wars. And then I think I had a third category. And what it was, we were making a new Netflix Marvel superhero show, and the main characters were, and then we just popcorned. It was a improv session, and popcorn around the table just to build it, because it was that Daniel taught me the something silly together, where you're a little bit vulnerable. It's that shortcut to trust. I think it was one of the first Agitare events that I went to, where you guys brought that up, and you were like, totally cheating, totally using the brain's hardwiring against itself. But I also, I did it one session with the officers and one session with the senior NCOs. And I said to the senior NCOs, you do this every day when you BS with your office. When you walk in and you have a topic, and you you have a problem that needs to get solved, but you walk in and you BS for just a little bit and joke around, you're repaving that trust road. Something I've tried to do was insert some kind of mental sherbet, even if it's just, I hate to say it, even if it's just going to the bathroom and getting some box breathing in between problem area, focus areas, as just, and I would consider that, in this discussion, there's some creative procrastination there, because I'm creating a logical break, and a time break before working on whatever the next thing is, to allow for that context shifting. And more often than not, I've been playing the over and over again, playing the Einstein quote out in the office with the, if he had an hour to solve a problem that would save his life, he'd take 55 minutes to formulate the question and 5 minutes to answer it. But my God, does it prove out to just take that time? And I threw the Hannibal because it's fun, the A-Team quote, about that if you, and it's over time like that. I mean, I get the same bursts that Daniel talked about, where I wake up at 2 a.m. and I have to go write down whatever is coming out, or it is long gone at 5 or 4:30. Yeah, and I've got fleets of notebooks. If anybody ever needs a recommendation, field notes. If you're a Buy American person, it's American made on American paper, I think, and American inker, but I don't know. But they're a great product. They make a great birthday or a holiday present if anybody's ever asking you for what to get you, and you can customize all sorts of stuff. But yeah, that writing it down, having it written down, and then putting it away to think about it for a while is so powerful. I've been exploring a lot with recurring problems. And I'll try and find a field notes, but recurring problems, to see them coming. Like every year you have annual award cycle. Well, moving back from the annual award cycle, we can start thinking about that 3 months out, and not through a suspense, not through an institutional solution, but more internal. I can begin documenting the things that I'm interested in, and now it's not a crisis. And then I can think about it more and think about it more. And we've been trying to do that a lot with some of the recurring questions we get, because especially as some of the organizations, 16th Air Force especially, has been standing up, there is a lot of friction and a lot of churn. So we're able to kind of see that, okay, if we're 3 weeks out from probably getting this question, we don't need to wait until it's a 24-hour suspense to answer. We can spend 3 weeks working on a deliberate response and try and get that. And Ward, did you want the field notes link? Is that okay? I'll get that and drop it in chat.
I love that note on mental sherbet. There's something that they do in Think Wrong that they teach in the Think Wrong intensive that really stuck with me. Was there's this one exercise where we had been working on a problem. You're exhausted every day. We'd been working on a pretty heavy problem for like a day and a half, and we came to this exercise, which was just a 1 hour walk. It was a silent walk. And as a group, we went and we walked around the city of Austin and just observed things. And it was strangely heavy, just kind of because you've been processing all this information. And there's also this thing, there's this thing from Kinevin called, you talk about entrainment to certain cognitive patterns. There's this thing called the shallow dive into chaos, where you are trying to remove all the entrained patterns. So what happens when you're trying to solve a problem is you all kind of get entrained. You all kind of get aligned to these ways of thinking about the specific thing. You've kind of been in the problem a little too long. And this is what happens with writing as well. You write and you write and you write, and you start to like come into these common themes or this common language. And you have to kind of take yourself out of that context and remove that cognitive entrainment in order to actually get back into the problem with fresh eyes. And the Think Wrong flow drills are really good examples of that. And I think that they've got a couple of flow drills probably in their in their free stuff, but Silent Walk was one that kind of stuck with me. And it's walking silently is actually some of my favorite authors. Daniel Kahneman, the ones I can think of right now would be Daniel Kahneman as well as David Snowden. And I've encountered a number of other ones who have this practice. They have this ritual of walking silently or walking while in conversation. And it's actually something that Daniel Pink, I think, talked about in his book, When. He talks about the practice of going on a walk and how powerful that is for, you kind of break up that entrainment that happens with the way your thinking patterns. And then it does these things physiologically. It wakes you up. It gets the blood flowing. You're literally in a different environment, right? You're outside. And I think that actually for me, being out in nature is like a big thing. It's like a big aspect of this. The best way for me to really get out of a kind of entrained cognitive state is to go out and actually go on a walk or go on a hike for like an hour or something, and then get back into it.
But wrapping up here, we have about 4 minutes left. I just want to thank everybody for showing up, and thanks for diving into these to creative procrastination and adaptive communication. I hope that you will leave any retrospectives onto the Miro board. We're trying to make this event better. And so if you have any suggestions on how this is presenting to you and how it could maybe present to a broader community, please share that information with us in the retrospectives area. Thank you for attending the third Fishbowl.
Right?
Yeah, this has been fantastic.
37.
Thank you so much, Cuss and Chris, for putting this together. All of your hard work. It pays off every time. And as much as I'm kind of before every time, I'm like, the weekend, come on, guys. Every time afterwards,
Right.
I'm like, man, I'm actually really glad I spent a significant portion of my weekend doing that. It doesn't feel like work. It's a fantastic opportunity to just explore topics with everybody.
That's why I said I feel like I should be paying you guys for this. This is awesome. It's like free therapy. I kind of wanted to draw by, so not that I'm starting a trend here or anything, but it seems to fit in line with kind of how the conversation kind of wrapped up here. A very simple exercise as a facilitator, if you want to try something, no matter what space you work in, whether it's a space with no windows or it's a building, or maybe you guys are all virtually working as a team in remote dispersed environments. Inspired by Think Wrong, and it's one I got to run actually with a team of Michaels, the one being the wizard behind the scenes today and partaking all at the same time. System spotting and system hacking, and it's really simple. It's a Think Wrong tandem exercise that starts off with going out and doing sort of what Daniel was just talking about, except slightly more active, going out and just spotting systems around you. Coming back from that is actually using the system hacking, where you take what you've found, those systems that your teams have gone out and walked around and been inspired to see and interact with. You hack your problem with inspiration from those systems. And there's a much more detail that Think Wrong gives you on how to apply it, but in simple short form, that's kind of how the exercise plays out. And I have to say, just one of the coolest examples I saw come back from one that I ran was a team went out and came back and said automated water system. And I had no idea what that was from their system spotting. They were like, it's sprinklers. And I was like, oh, water sprinklers, automated water system. They applied that to a newsletter setting. And they were like, what if we actually got to where we could do automated newsletters to go out, but allow people to automatically register for them? And this idea came out of nowhere. We weren't talking about newsletters 30 minutes before they left. We hadn't ever considered the idea. It came out from one of the individuals partaking in this little effort we were doing, just walking around and seeing a sprinkler come on. So I think there's always insights and there's always sparks of creativity out there. And I feel like that fits in with creative procrastination. So facilitated exercise that's really low risk. Tell people to go on a walk. It's awesome.
And lastly, before we wrap things up, I'd really like to implore anybody to, if you learned something during this fishbowl or any other fishbowls and you've put it into practice, please let us know in some fashion so we can highlight that, because it's really, these talks are great and I know that we do get something out of them, but to see it in practice and to hear about that would be just epic. So